Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the worn leather boots of medieval minstrels. These weren't the romantic troubadours you see in movies, they were something far more desperate, something far more dangerous. Picture this. You're walking alone on a muddy road in the dead of winter. Your lute is your only possession. Your stomach hasn't seen a full meal in 3 days, and up ahead there's a castle. Inside that castle, drunk nobles are waiting. They might throw you coins, they might throw you in a dungeon. You won't know until you start singing. This was the reality for thousands of travelling musicians in medieval Europe. And tonight, you'll discover why most of them didn't live to see 40. Before you settle into this journey through the harsh world of medieval music, take a moment to like this video if you're grateful you can enjoy music without risking your life for it. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, let's talk about what it really meant to be a minstrel. The word itself comes from the Latin ministerialis. It means servant. That should tell you everything you need to know about their status. But even servant is generous. Most people saw minstrels as barely above beggars, sometimes below them. You need to understand something crucial. Medieval society had strict hierarchies. Everyone had a place. Nobles at the top, clergy next, then merchants and craftsmen, then peasants who worked the land. And then at the very bottom you had wanderers, people without land, people without a lord to serve, people who moved from place to place. Minstrels were wanderers. This meant they had almost no legal protections. If someone attacked you on the road, good luck getting justice. If a lord decided he didn't like your song, there was no court you could appeal to. You were outside the system. And the system didn't care about you. Let's start with the roads themselves. Medieval roads weren't like modern highways. They were dirt paths, muddy in winter, dusty in summer, full of ruts and holes. You walked these roads alone. Or, if you were lucky, with 1 or 2 other minstrels. You carried everything you owned on your back. Your instrument, a spare tunic if you had one, maybe a blanket. Bandits loved these roads. They hid in forests and waited for travelers. A minstrel was an easy target. You had no armor, no weapons worth mentioning, no guards. Some minstrels tried to look poor on purpose. They thought bandits might leave them alone. But bandits weren't picky. They'd rob you even if you only had a few pennies. Sometimes they'd take your instrument just to sell it. And if you fought back, well, you were one person with maybe a small knife. They were several people with real weapons. The math wasn't in your favor. But bandits weren't the only danger. There were wolves in many parts of Europe, bears in some regions, wild boars that could gore you if you startled them. You walked through all of this, day after day, mile after mile. The weather didn't care about your schedule. Rain would soak you to the bone. Your instrument could warp from the moisture. Your strings could snap. And if your instrument broke, you couldn't earn money. No money meant no food. Winter was the worst. Freezing temperatures, snow, ice. You needed shelter every night or you might not wake up. But shelter cost money, or it required finding someone willing to let you sleep in their barn. Many minstrels got sick from exposure. Pneumonia killed plenty of them. So did infected wounds from falls or fights. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals as we know them. If you got seriously ill on the road, you probably died on the road. Now let's talk about where you were going. Castles, manor houses, towns, anywhere people might pay for entertainment. You'd arrive at a castle gate, muddy, exhausted, hungry, and you'd have to convince the guards to let you in. Sometimes they would, sometimes they'd laugh and send you away. If you got inside, you'd perform in the great hall. The lord would be sitting at the high table, his family beside him, his knights and important guests nearby, servants running around, dogs fighting over scraps on the floor. And you'd stand there, trying to be heard over the noise, trying to make these people like you enough to pay you. Here's what most people don't realize. You weren't just a musician. You couldn't be. You had to be a complete entertainer. You sang, yes, but you also had to tell jokes, recite poetry, do acrobatics if you could, juggle, perform magic tricks, play multiple instruments if possible. The more skills you had, the better your chances of earning money. A minstrel who only played one instrument, he'd starve. You needed variety. You needed to amaze people. Think about that for a second. You're learning to play instruments without formal training. You're teaching yourself to juggle, to do backflips, to walk on your hands, all while traveling constantly, all while barely eating enough. And you had to do all of this well. If you were mediocre, nobles wouldn't pay you. They'd seen plenty of entertainers. You had to stand out. But here's where it gets really dangerous. You were also expected to bring news. Medieval people didn't have newspapers. They didn't have internet. They didn't have television. News travelled by word of mouth. And minstrels were one of the main ways news spread. You'd go from town to town, castle to castle, and people would ask you what was happening elsewhere. What were other lords doing? Were there wars brewing, scandals, marriages, deaths? So you became a kind of journalist. You gathered information as you travelled, you remembered it, and you shared it, often in the form of songs. This sounds harmless until you think about the implications. What if the news you shared made a lord angry? What if you sang about something he wanted kept quiet? What if you accidentally repeated a rumour that turned out to be false? Lords had power, absolute power over their domains. If you offended one, he could have you whipped, thrown in a dungeon, mutilated, killed, and it wasn't always clear what would offend them. Nobles were unpredictable, especially when they were drunk, which they often were during feasts. One night, a lord might love your song about a distant war. The next night, a different lord might hate the same song because he was allied with the losing side. You never knew. Some minstrels became very good at reading the room. They'd watch the lord's face as they performed. If he started looking angry, they'd quickly switch to a different song, a safer topic, something flattering about the lord himself. But even that was risky. Flattery could seem insincere. Or you might accidentally flatter the lord in a way that reminded him of an enemy. There was no winning formula. Many minstrels got beaten for their performances. Some got worse. There are records of minstrels being maimed, having their tongues cut out for singing the wrong thing, having their fingers broken so they couldn't play anymore. And remember, you had no legal recourse. You couldn't sue a lord. You couldn't report him to authorities. He was the authority in his domain. Your only option was to leave if you could, and hope the next place would be better. Let's talk about payment, because even when things went well, you weren't getting rich. Most of the time, you'd perform and then wait. The lord might toss you a few coins, or he might give you a meal and send you on your way, or he might give you nothing at all and expect you to be grateful you weren't punished. There was no set rate for your services, no contract, no guarantee. You performed first and hoped for payment after. Some lords were generous. They'd give you silver coins, maybe a new tunic, a good meal, a warm place to sleep. These were the exceptions you lived for. But most lords gave you just enough to keep you alive. Copper pennies, stale bread, a spot in the stables for the night. And then there were the lords who gave you nothing. They considered the honour of performing for them to be payment enough. What were you going to do about it? Complain? That's how you got thrown out, or worse. The unpredictability of payment created a brutal cycle. You never knew if you'd have money for your next meal, so you couldn't plan, you couldn't save, you just moved from place to place, hoping the next performance would go better than the last. This uncertainty affected everything. Your health deteriorated because you ate irregularly. Sometimes you'd feast at a generous lord's table, other times you'd go days with barely any food. Your body couldn't handle these extremes. Malnutrition was common among minstrels. It weakened your immune system, made you vulnerable to every illness that passed through the towns you visited. And illness meant you couldn't perform, which meant no income, which meant more hunger. The spiral went down quickly. Let's talk about the social stigma, because the contempt people had for minstrels went deeper than you might think. The church actively despised minstrels. Medieval Christianity was suspicious of entertainment, especially entertainment that involved dancing, drinking, and rowdy behaviour. Priests preached that minstrels were servants of the devil. They claimed your music led people into sin, that you distracted good Christians from prayer and work. Some church councils actually tried to ban minstrels completely. They forbade Christians from hosting them, from paying them, from even watching them perform. These bans were rarely fully enforced. People liked entertainment too much. But the stigma remained. In the eyes of the church, you were spiritually dangerous. This meant something very practical and very terrible. When you died, you might not get a Christian burial. Christian burial was important in medieval society. People believed that without it, your soul might not reach heaven. You might be trapped as a ghost or sent straight to hell. But minstrels were often denied burial in consecrated ground. Churches refused to take your body. You'd be buried outside the churchyard, in unconsecrated earth, like a criminal or a suicide. Your family, if you had one, would have to live with that shame. The knowledge that you were buried like an outcast, that priests wouldn't pray for your soul. Some minstrels tried to repent on their deathbeds. They'd renounce their profession, promise never to perform again, beg for forgiveness. Sometimes this worked. A sympathetic priest might grant you last rites, might allow a proper burial, but sometimes it didn't. The stigma was too strong. Now imagine living your whole life knowing this, knowing that society saw you as barely human, that the church considered you damned, that when you died, you'd be cast out even from the cemetery. This psychological weight was immense. It's something we can't fully understand today. Medieval people truly believed in hell, in damnation, in eternal suffering. And they were told repeatedly that this was your fate as a minstrel. Yet people still became minstrels. Why? Because they had no other choice. Most minstrels came from the lowest classes. They were orphans, disabled people who couldn't do hard labor, youngest sons with no inheritance, people fleeing debt or scandal. The medieval economy was rigid. If you weren't born into a trade, you couldn't just learn one. Guilds controlled crafts. You needed money to apprentice. You needed connections. You needed family backing. Minstrels needed none of that. If you could sing or play an instrument, even badly, you could try to earn money as a minstrel. The barrier to entry was low. This meant the competition was fierce. There were thousands of minstrels across Europe, all competing for the same coins, all travelling the same routes. The skilled ones could sometimes find steady employment. A lord might hire a minstrel to stay at his castle permanently, to perform regularly for his household. This was the dream: steady food, a warm place to sleep, protection. But these positions were rare, and even then you were still a servant, still at the bottom of the hierarchy, still subject to the lord's whims. Most minstrels never achieved this. They stayed on the roads their whole lives, moving, performing, surviving. Let's talk about the physical toll of the profession, because your body was your instrument. If it failed, you had nothing. Playing music for hours is physically demanding. Your fingers would blister, then callous, then sometimes become arthritic as you aged. Lutenists developed problems with their wrists and hands, fiddlers got shoulder pain, singers strained their voices, especially in loud, crowded halls where you had to project over noise. And remember, you were also doing acrobatics, tumbling, juggling. These weren't occasional tricks. You did them night after night, year after year. Your joints wore down, your back accumulated injuries. You might pull muscles, sprain ankles, break bones in falls. There was no physical therapy, no pain medication beyond alcohol. You either kept performing through the pain, or you stopped earning money. Many older minstrels were walking collections of injuries, limping, hunched, hands gnarled, voices hoarse, but still performing. Because what else could they do? Some minstrels were blind. This might surprise you, but blindness didn't disqualify you from the profession. In fact, blind minstrels were relatively common. A blind person in medieval society had very few options. They couldn't farm, couldn't fight, couldn't do most crafts, but they could memorize songs. They could develop their hearing to be incredibly acute. Some of the most famous minstrels in medieval records were blind. They'd memorize vast repertoires of songs, hundreds of verses, dozens of melodies, all carried in their minds. But being a blind minstrel made the dangers even worse. You couldn't see bandits approaching, couldn't navigate unfamiliar roads easily, couldn't read the faces of nobles to know when to stop singing. You relied on guides, other minstrels who could see, or you'd pay children to lead you from town to town. This cost money you often didn't have. The roads were especially treacherous for blind minstrels. You might step in holes, walk into branches, trip over roots. Every journey was a minefield of potential injury. Yet they persisted, because even as a blind minstrel, you had more agency than as a blind beggar. You had a skill, a purpose, a way to earn your bread with dignity, however limited. Let's discuss the repertoire you needed, the songs and stories you had to know. You couldn't just perform whatever you liked, you needed to know what your audience wanted, and different audiences wanted different things. At noble courts, you performed chansons de geste, epic poems about heroic knights, songs about courtly love, stories of King Arthur or Charlemagne. These were sophisticated, often in French, even in England or Germany. Nobles liked to seem cultured. In taverns, you performed bawdy songs, drinking songs, funny stories about cuckolded husbands or foolish priests. The cruder, the better. People were drunk and wanted to laugh. In town squares, you performed songs about current events, ballads about recent battles, stories about local scandals, information mixed with entertainment. You had to know all of this, had to switch between registers instantly, had to read your audience and give them what they wanted. And you had to keep learning new material. Old songs got stale, audiences wanted novelty, so you were constantly picking up new songs from other minstrels, adapting stories you heard, making up new verses to old tunes. This required a phenomenal memory. Remember, you couldn't write things down and read them while performing. You had to memorize everything: words, melodies, chord progressions, stories, jokes. Some minstrels could perform for hours without repeating themselves. They'd know dozens of complete song cycles, each one containing multiple parts, each part telling a different section of a long story. This skill took years to develop. Young minstrels would attach themselves to experienced ones, travel with them, learn from them. It was an informal apprenticeship system. But it also meant that knowledge was concentrated in a few skilled performers. If they died without passing on their songs, that material was lost forever, and many did die suddenly, from illness, from violence, from accidents. Entire song traditions vanished this way. Stories that had been passed down orally for generations, gone because one minstrel died on a cold road without an apprentice. Now let's talk about women minstrels, because they existed, though history often forgets them. Being a female minstrel was even more dangerous than being a male one. Society viewed travelling women with intense suspicion. A woman without a husband or father to protect her, without a fixed home, this was scandalous. Many people assumed female minstrels were prostitutes. The stigma was automatic. It didn't matter if you were just performing music. Society had decided what you must be. This meant female minstrels faced constant harassment, from guards at castle gates, from men in taverns, from other travellers on the road. You were seen as available, as fair game. Some female minstrels travelled with male partners for protection, husbands or brothers or fellow performers, but this wasn't always possible, and it didn't always help. The church was especially harsh on female minstrels. Priests thundered about the dangers of women who sang and danced. They called them temptresses, agents of corruption. Yet women still performed. Some became quite famous in their regions. They'd specialise in certain types of songs, love ballads, laments, religious hymns performed in vernacular languages. But their careers were often short. Marriage usually ended a woman's performing career, so did pregnancy, and society pressured women to settle down, to stop wandering, to become respectable. Male minstrels could perform into old age. Female minstrels rarely lasted past their 20s. The ones who continued often did so out of desperation. Widows with no other means of support. women fleeing abusive situations, outcasts with nowhere else to turn. Let's talk about what happened when you arrived in a new town. Because this wasn't as simple as just showing up and performing. Most medieval towns had regulations about who could perform where. Local musicians had established territories. They didn't appreciate competition from wandering minstrels. Town musicians often belonged to guilds. These guilds had agreements with town councils. They had exclusive rights to perform at certain events, weddings, festivals, official ceremonies. When you rolled into town as a traveling minstrel, you were threatening their income, and they'd let you know it. Sometimes town musicians would confront you directly, tell you to move along, threaten you if you tried to perform. You were one person, they were many, and they had the law on their side. Other times they'd complain to town authorities. Guards would be sent to chase you out. You might be fined or locked up overnight as a vagrant. Some towns were more tolerant. They'd allow travelling minstrels to perform in certain areas, usually the poorest neighbourhoods, or outside the town walls, places where you couldn't compete with established musicians. But even then you needed permission. You'd have to find whoever was in charge, explain yourself, maybe pay a small fee for the privilege of performing, and if you performed without permission, you could be arrested, have your instrument confiscated, be publicly humiliated. Medieval towns took these regulations seriously. This meant you spent a lot of time negotiating, pleading, trying to find someone who'd let you earn a few coins. It was exhausting before you even started performing. The actual performance locations varied wildly. Sometimes you'd perform in a lord's hall, relatively safe, relatively comfortable. But more often you performed in taverns or market squares or on street corners, places where anyone could watch and anyone could cause trouble. Tavern performances were common. Tavern owners liked having entertainment. It brought in customers, made people stay longer, spend more on ale. But taverns were rowdy places. Drunk men looking for fights, arguments breaking out, dogs and sometimes pigs wandering through. The smell of unwashed bodies and stale beer. You'd stand in a corner trying to be heard over the chaos, trying to keep your instruments safe from flailing arms and thrown cups. Fights would break out mid-performance. You'd have to stop, wait for order to be restored, then try to continue. Sometimes you'd lose your audience completely. They'd be more interested in watching the brawl. And if furniture got broken during a fight, the tavern owner might blame you, claim your presence caused the disturbance, refuse to pay you, even demand you pay for damages. You had no recourse. You'd just leave, maybe with a few coins from sympathetic patrons, maybe with nothing. Market square performances had different problems. You were competing with everything else happening, merchants shouting their wares, animals being sold, town criers making announcements. You'd set up in a spot and hope people would stop to listen. Some would. Most would walk past. You'd perform to their backs as they went about their business. Children might gather to watch. That was good. Children brought parents. Parents had coins. But children also got bored quickly. They'd throw things if you lost their interest. Rotten vegetables, stones, whatever was handy. And there were always hecklers. People who thought it was funny to interrupt, to mock your singing, to make crude jokes. You had to develop thick skin, learn to deflect with humour, keep performing no matter what they said. Some minstrels became skilled at crowd work. They'd banter with hecklers, turn insults into comedy, make the crowd laugh with them instead of at them. This was a survival skill. But it required confidence, quick thinking, and the ability to read people instantly. Not every minstrel had these talents. The ones who didn't suffered for it. Let's discuss the equipment you needed. Your instruments weren't cheap, and they were fragile. Lutes were popular. They had a warm sound that worked well for both noble courts and taverns, but lute strings were made from animal gut. They broke frequently, and they were expensive to replace. You might go through several strings in a week of constant performing. Each one cost money. Money you might not have, so you'd learn to repair strings, tie broken ends together, make them last as long as possible. The lute body itself was delicate, made of thin wood. A hard fall could crack it, water damage could warp it, extreme temperature changes could make the glue joints separate. You carried your lute everywhere, held it while you walked, slept with it nearby to prevent theft, tried to protect it from rain and snow and rough handling. If your lute broke beyond repair, you were finished. A new one cost more than most minstrels earned in months, maybe years. You couldn't just buy a replacement. Some minstrels played fiddles instead, cheaper, more durable, louder too, which helped in noisy environments. But fiddles had their own problems. The bow needed horsehair. That horsehair wore out. You'd have to find someone who could rehair your bow, pay them, wait while they did the work. And fiddle strings broke just as often as lute strings. Same problem, same expense. Drums were the most durable instruments, hard to break, no strings to replace, but drums were also heavy, awkward to carry, and they were loud, sometimes too loud for intimate settings. Many minstrels played multiple instruments. This gave you versatility, but it also meant more equipment to carry, more things that could break, more maintenance. Some instruments you could make yourself. Simple flutes from wood or bone, rattles from gourds and pebbles. These were backups, not your primary instruments, but better than nothing if everything else failed. You also needed other equipment, juggling balls or clubs if you juggled, bright costume pieces to catch attention, props for stories or comic routines. All of this had to fit in a pack. Or maybe a small cart if you were lucky enough to have one. Everything you owned, your whole livelihood, carried on your back. Theft was a constant worry. Other travellers might rob you. Unscrupulous innkeepers might steal from your room. Even other minstrels might take your things if you weren't careful. You slept lightly, kept your valuables close, trusted no one completely. This was just survival. Now let's talk about the seasonal nature of the work, because not all times of year were equal for minstrels. Winter was the worst season for many reasons. The weather made travel dangerous. Roads became nearly impassable. Freezing temperatures could kill you if you got caught without shelter. But winter was also when nobles held the most feasts. Christmas season especially. They'd gather in their warm halls, eat and drink and want entertainment. So you had to brave the worst weather to reach the best opportunities. You'd travel through snow and ice, risk frostbite, risk falling through frozen rivers. Many minstrels didn't survive winter journeys. They'd freeze to death on the road, or get stuck in snowstorms, or fall ill from exposure and die in some village far from anyone who knew them. Spring brought better weather, but it also brought less work. Nobles were busy with estate management, peasants were busy with planting, people had less time and money for entertainment. You'd move between smaller venues, perform at local celebrations, weddings if you were lucky. But the pay was smaller, the audiences less generous. Summer had fairs and festivals. These were gold mines for minstrels, hundreds of people gathering, everyone in a festive mood, merchants doing good business and willing to spend on entertainment. You'd travel from fair to fair, following a circuit that many minstrels knew. Competition was intense. Every minstrel in the region would show up. You'd be fighting for attention. The best spots at fairs went to the most famous minstrels, or those who paid officials for prime locations. You might get stuck in a corner, or outside the main fairgrounds, making whatever you could from passers-by. Autumn brought harvest festivals, more opportunities, but also the knowledge that winter was coming. You'd try to save money, find a place that might take you in for the cold months. Some minstrels would attach themselves to a monastery or manor for winter, offer to perform regularly in exchange for food and shelter. This was survival, not a career move. Others would hole up in cities, perform in taverns, live in the poorest quarters, endure the cold and hope to make it to spring. The seasonal cycle repeated every year, and every year some minstrels didn't make it through. Let's discuss the political dangers of the profession. Because minstrels existed in a politically charged world, medieval Europe was constantly at war. Lords fought each other, kings fought other kings, alliances shifted, borders changed, and you had to navigate all of it. A song that was safe in one lord's territory might be treasonous in another's. You had to know who was allied with whom, who was at war, what topics were forbidden where. This required staying informed, listening to gossip, paying attention to which banners flew where, understanding the complex web of medieval politics, and you had to adjust your repertoire constantly. A song praising King Edward might get you rewarded in English territories, but singing it in Scotland or France could get you killed. Some minstrels became adept at political neutrality. They'd perform songs that offended no one, love ballads, religious hymns, stories from ancient times with no modern parallels. But this was boring. Audiences wanted excitement. They wanted songs about current events, about their enemies' defeats, about their own side's victories. So you'd take risks, you'd perform politically charged material, and hope you'd read the room correctly. Sometimes you hadn't. A lord's wife might be from the kingdom you just mocked in song. A knight in the audience might have lost his brother in the battle you celebrated. The atmosphere would shift. You'd feel it, the room getting colder, faces hardening, and you'd know you'd made a terrible mistake. The smart minstrels learned to pivot quickly. You'd notice the mood change and immediately shift to something safer. A joke, a different song, an apology disguised as humility. Sometimes this worked. The Lord would laugh, the tension would break, you'd escape with your skin intact. Other times it didn't work. Guards would be summoned, you'd be dragged out. What happened next depended entirely on the lord's temperament. Merciful lords might just have you beaten and thrown out. The beating was severe enough to teach you a lesson, but you'd survive, you'd heal, you could continue your career though you'd never return to that castle. Cruel lords had other punishments in mind. Some would have you mutilated as an example, cut off an ear, brand your face, remove fingers so you couldn't play instruments anymore. These weren't empty threats. There are historical records of minstrels being punished this way. Their crimes, singing the wrong song, telling the wrong story, making the wrong joke. And remember, this was all legal. Lords had jurisdiction over their lands. They could punish anyone within their territory however they saw fit. No trial, no appeal, just their word as law. The threat of violence hung over every performance. You never knew when you might cross an invisible line, when a joke might land wrong, when a song might remind someone of something painful. This constant anxiety was part of the job. You performed with a smile, made it look effortless, but inside you were always calculating, always watching, always ready to flee if things went bad. Some minstrels developed nervous conditions from this stress. They'd shake before performances, stutter, forget lyrics they'd known for years. The psychological toll was immense, and there was no therapy, no support systems. You either learned to cope or you broke down. If you broke down, you couldn't work. If you couldn't work, you starved. Let's talk about the religious content you had to perform. This was another minefield. The church might despise minstrels, but it also used them. Bishops and abbots sometimes hired minstrels to perform religious songs, to spread Christian messages to illiterate populations. These performances required careful handling. You couldn't be too entertaining. That would suggest you were glorifying yourself rather than God. But you couldn't be boring. Then people wouldn't listen and the whole purpose failed. You had to strike a balance. Dignified but engaging, reverent but accessible. This was harder than it sounds. Religious authorities would scrutinize these performances, looking for heresy, for anything that deviated from orthodox teaching. If they found something objectionable, you'd be in serious trouble. Heresy charges were no joke in medieval Europe. People were burned at the stake for less. A minstrel accused of spreading heretical ideas might face interrogation, torture, execution. So you stuck to approved hymns, traditional stories from the Bible, nothing original, nothing that could be misinterpreted, nothing that gave authorities any excuse to come after you. But audiences found this material dull. They'd heard these stories 1,000 times. They wanted novelty, entertainment, something to hold their attention. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. You either bored your audience or risked charges of impiety. Many minstrels avoided religious content altogether because of this. But avoiding it completely had its own problems. People expected some religious material, especially during religious festivals. A minstrel who never performed religious songs seemed suspicious, possibly impious themselves. You couldn't win. You just had to navigate these contradictions as best you could and hope you didn't make a fatal mistake. Let's discuss the relationships between minstrels. Because you weren't always alone on the road. Some minstrels traveled in small groups, 2 or 3 together. This provided safety, protection from bandits, someone to watch your back. These partnerships were crucial. You'd share resources, split earnings, help each other when sick or injured. It was survival strategy as much as friendship. But partnerships also created tension. Money had to be divided, and not everyone pulled their weight equally. One minstrel might be more talented, draw bigger crowds, earn more coins. Should earnings be split evenly, or should the more talented performer get more? These questions caused arguments. Resentments festered. Partnerships broke apart. Some minstrels specialized in different instruments. You'd have a lute player and a fiddle player together, or a singer and a juggler, complementary skills that created a better show. These partnerships worked better. Each person had their role, less competition, more cooperation, but they were still vulnerable to the same tensions about money and recognition. Romantic relationships between traveling minstrels happened too, men and women performing together, sometimes married, sometimes not. Medieval society frowned on this arrangement, but minstrels were already outcasts. They had less to lose. These couples faced unique challenges. Pregnancy ended a woman's ability to perform, but the couple still needed income. The man would have to work twice as hard, or they'd have to settle somewhere, give up the traveling life. Children born to minstrel couples had bleak futures. They often followed their parents into the profession, not from choice, but because what else could they do? They were born into the lowest social class, born into a stigmatized profession. These children grew up on the roads. They learned to perform before they could read, learned to juggle before they learned proper trades. They inherited their parents' precarious existence. Some minstrels were fiercely competitive with each other. They'd sabotage rivals, spread rumors about other performers, try to steal their best material. If you developed a new song that audiences loved, other minstrels would memorize it, perform it themselves. There was no copyright, no protection for intellectual property. Good material was stolen constantly. This created a strange dynamic. Minstrels needed each other for survival, for sharing information about which lords were generous, which roads were safe, where festivals were happening. But they were also competing for the same limited resources, the same coins, the same performance slots, the same patrons. Trust was always conditional. You'd help another minstrel today. Tomorrow they might be competing against you for a lucrative position. Relationships were transactional, alliances temporary. Older minstrels sometimes took on apprentices, young people who wanted to learn the trade. This was beneficial for both parties. The apprentice got training, protection, and introduction to the profession. The older minstrel got help carrying equipment, someone to watch their belongings, assistance with performances. But these relationships could be exploitative. Some older minstrels treated apprentices like servants, worked them hard, paid them little or nothing, kept them dependent. An apprentice who complained might be abandoned on the road, left without resources or connections, so they endured, hoping to eventually strike out on their own. The successful ones did eventually leave, set up their own careers, but they carried the scars of their apprenticeship, the lessons learned about how harsh this world was, how little compassion existed. Let's talk about fame. Because some minstrels did become famous, their names known across regions, their skills celebrated, fame helped. Famous minstrels could command higher fees, could be more selective about where they performed, could negotiate better treatment. But fame in the medieval world was different from modern celebrity. There was no mass media, no recordings. Your fame was limited to the regions you'd travelled, the people who'd heard you perform. Beyond that, you were unknown. A famous minstrel in France meant nothing in England. You'd have to build your reputation from scratch in each new region. And fame didn't protect you from danger. Famous minstrels still travelled the same dangerous roads, still faced the same bandits, still dealt with drunk nobles who might turn violent. In some ways, fame made you more of a target. People knew you had money, or assumed you did. Bandits specifically looked for famous minstrels to rob. Other performers resented famous minstrels, saw them as competition, might try to undermine them, spread false rumours, sabotage their performances. Fame was a double-edged sword. It brought benefits, but also new vulnerabilities. Some minstrels actively avoided fame. They preferred anonymity, moving quietly from place to place, drawing no special attention. This was safer, less stress, though it also meant less income. The tension between wanting success and wanting safety defined many minstrel careers. How much risk were you willing to take? How much exposure could you handle? There was no right answer. Different minstrels made different choices. Some gambled on fame and won. Others gambled and lost everything. Now let's discuss what happened when you got too old to perform, because your body would eventually give out. Most minstrels didn't live to old age. The lifestyle killed them first. Disease, violence, accidents, exposure. The mortality rate was high, but some survived into their 50s or 60s. By then, they were worn out. Arthritic hands, damaged voices, backs that couldn't handle acrobatics anymore. You couldn't perform at the level you once did. Audiences noticed. They were less generous, less patient with mistakes. Your income dropped. Some older minstrels transitioned to teaching. They'd find a monastery or noble house willing to employ them as music instructors. This was the best outcome. No more travelling. No more travelling. But these positions were rare. Most older minstrels had no such opportunity. Others tried to survive on charity. They'd return to places where they'd performed successfully when younger, hoped that people remembered them fondly, that someone would take pity. Sometimes this worked. A generous lord might give an aging minstrel a permanent place in his household, not to perform, just to live out their days in relative comfort. More often, it didn't work. Nobody wanted to support an old performer who couldn't perform anymore. You became just another beggar, and medieval society had little compassion for beggars. Some aging minstrels ended up in poorhouses. These were grim places, overcrowded buildings where the destitute went to die. You'd get minimal food, a place to sleep, nothing more. The conditions were terrible. Disease spread quickly. Violence was common among desperate people competing for scraps. Many didn't last long once they ended up there. Others simply died on the roads, still travelling, still trying to perform, their bodies giving out in some nameless village, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten within days. This was the fate that haunted every minstrel. The knowledge that no matter how successful you were, you'd likely end your days in poverty and obscurity. There was no retirement plan, no pension, no safety net. You performed until you couldn't. Then you hoped someone would show mercy. Most of the time, nobody did. The awareness of this grim future affected how minstrels lived. Some became reckless, spent whatever they earned immediately. Why save for a future that would be miserable anyway? Others tried desperately to save money. Hidden coins sewn into clothes, valuables buried in secret locations, pathetic attempts to create security in an inherently insecure existence. But savings rarely lasted. An injury would force you to spend it all on medicine, or bandits would find your hiding place, or someone you trusted would steal from you. The system was designed to keep you poor, to keep you desperate, to keep you performing no matter what. Let's talk about the actual performance techniques, because this was skilled work, even if society didn't recognize it. You had to memorize hours of material, songs with dozens of verses, epic poems that took half an hour to recite, stories with complex plots and multiple characters. And you couldn't just recite mechanically, you had to make it engaging, use different voices for different characters, vary your tone and volume, create drama and suspense. This required real talent. The ability to hold an audience's attention for extended periods, to make them laugh or cry or sit in rapt silence. You studied people constantly, watched which parts of songs got reactions, which jokes landed, which stories made people lean forward. You refined your material based on these observations. Good minstrels were master psychologists. They understood crowd dynamics, knew how to read a room, could sense when energy was flagging and needed a change of pace. You'd start performances with something upbeat, get people's attention. Then you might shift to something slower, more emotional, build to a climax, end with something memorable. This wasn't random, it was calculated. Every successful minstrel developed their own formula, their own rhythm for structuring performances. Physical stamina was crucial. You might perform for hours without breaks, standing the whole time, playing instruments, singing, moving around to engage different parts of the crowd. Your core muscles had to be strong to support your breathing for singing. Your legs had to handle long periods of standing. Your arms and shoulders had to endure repetitive motions of playing instruments. This was athletic performance disguised as art. You trained your body like a soldier trained for war, because your body was your livelihood. Voice technique was something you learned through trial and error. There were no formal vocal coaches, no one to teach you how to project without damaging your voice. Many minstrels ruined their voices by their 30s, pushing too hard, performing in bad conditions, trying to be heard over noisy crowds. Nodes would form on their vocal cords, their voices would become raspy, eventually fail altogether. Smart minstrels learned to use their voices efficiently, to let the acoustics of a room help them, to pace themselves during long performances, but this wisdom came at a cost, usually years of damage before you figured it out. Instrumental technique was similarly self-taught. You learned by watching other minstrels, by experimenting, by making countless mistakes. Some instruments were easier to learn than others. A simple flute could be mastered relatively quickly. A lute required years of practice to play well. Complex fingerings, precise timing, delicate touch. The best minstrels made it look effortless. Their fingers would dance across strings. They'd play intricate melodies while simultaneously singing different melodies. It was impressive. But behind that ease were thousands of hours of practice. Bleeding fingers in the beginning, frustration at mistakes, slow, painful progress toward competence. And you had to maintain your skills constantly. A week without practice and you'd get rusty, your fingers would lose their calluses, your muscle memory would fade, you couldn't afford to take breaks. Stage presence was another crucial skill. You had to command attention from the moment you appeared. Stand confidently, make eye contact, project charisma. This was harder than it sounds when you were exhausted, hungry, worried about where your next meal would come from, but you had to fake it, had to seem energetic and enthusiastic even when you felt dead inside. Audiences could sense weakness. If you seemed uncertain or timid, they'd lose interest, or worse, they'd mock you. Confidence was armor. Even false confidence was better than none. Some minstrels developed elaborate personas. They'd create characters to perform as, give themselves exotic backstories, claim to have traveled to distant lands, whatever made them more interesting. These personas weren't entirely lies, they were marketing, ways to stand out in a crowded field, to give audiences something to remember. But maintaining a persona was exhausting. You had to stay in character, remember your backstory, never slip up and reveal the truth. It was like being an actor who never left the stage. Let's discuss the repertoire in more detail. The actual content of what you performed. Chansons de geste were epic poems. They told stories of legendary heroes, Roland at Roncevaux, the deeds of Charlemagne, William of Orange. These were serious works, often hundreds of verses long. Performing these required stamina and memory. You'd recite for an hour or more, keeping the narrative thread clear, varying your delivery to maintain interest. Noble audiences loved these epics. They saw themselves reflected in the heroic knights. The stories reinforced their worldview. their sense of honor and martial valor. But the epics were also propaganda. They glorified violence, celebrated conquest, demonized enemies. You were spreading ideology as much as entertainment. Some minstrels felt uncomfortable with this. But you performed what audiences wanted, what paid. Your personal feelings didn't matter. Courtly love songs were another staple. These were more lyrical, less narrative-driven. They expressed longing, devotion to unattainable noble ladies, elaborate metaphors about love as a religious experience. These songs had specific conventions. The lover was always suffering. The lady was always perfect but distant. There was never consummation, just eternal yearning. Modern audiences would find this tedious, but medieval nobles ate it up. It was their romantic ideal, the poetry they aspired to embody. You had to perform these songs with seeming sincerity, even though everyone knew they were artificial. It was a game. Everyone understood the rules. But you had to play along. Fableaux were comic tales, usually crude, full of sexual innuendo and bathroom humor. These were for common audiences, peasants, merchants, tavern crowds. The plots were simple. A clever wife cuckolding her stupid husband, a greedy priest getting his comeuppance, a foolish knight being outsmarted by a peasant, social order temporarily inverted for laughs. These tales allowed common people to mock their betters, to see nobles and clergy portrayed as fools. It was cathartic, a release valve for social tensions. You had to be careful with fableaux around noble audiences. Some nobles enjoyed them. Others considered them beneath their dignity. You had to read the room carefully. Religious songs ranged from solemn hymns to lively miracle stories. The Virgin Mary featured prominently. So did popular saints. These songs taught religious lessons while entertaining. Some were actually quite beautiful. Medieval religious poetry could be genuinely moving. Even if you didn't believe, performing it well could affect an audience deeply. But you also performed more dubious material. Songs about fake miracles, relics of questionable authenticity, stories designed to encourage pilgrimages that enriched churches. You were part of the religious economy, whether you intended to be or not. Your performances drove people toward churches, toward buying indulgences, toward participating in religious life. News ballads were perhaps the most dangerous material. These reported recent events, battles, scandals, political machinations, set to memorable tunes so people would remember and repeat them. You were essentially a journalist, but with no protection, no press freedom, no appeals to any higher authority, just your wits and your ability to gauge what was safe to say. Some minstrels specialized in news ballads. They'd cultivate sources, gather information carefully, craft songs that informed without crossing dangerous lines. Others avoided news entirely, too risky, too easy to offend the wrong person. But audiences wanted news, so avoiding it meant losing potential earnings. The balance between safety and profit defined many careers. How much risk were you willing to take for potentially greater rewards? Let's talk about the actual economics in more detail. The money, or lack thereof, that defined your existence. A successful performance at a noble's court might earn you a few silver pennies, maybe even a gold coin if the lord was exceptionally generous and drunk. This was a windfall, enough to live on for weeks if you were careful. But these performances were rare. Most nights you earned copper pennies, sometimes just half pennies. A handful of these might buy you a loaf of bread, a place to sleep in a barn, nothing more. You had to budget constantly, calculate how far your money would stretch, how many days until you needed to perform again, what you could afford to eat. Many minstrels survived on the cheapest foods available. Stale bread, thin soup, whatever scraps they could get. Meat was a luxury, fresh fruit even rarer. Your diet was nutritionally poor. This malnutrition had serious effects. It weakened your immune system, made you vulnerable to disease, slowed healing when you got injured, affected your ability to think clearly. Performing while malnourished was brutal. You needed energy to sing, play instruments, do acrobatics, but you didn't have energy. You were running on empty most of the time. Some minstrels begged between performances. This was humiliating. But survival trumped pride. You'd stand on street corners with your hat out, hope people would toss in coins. The problem was that beggars were everywhere in medieval towns. Competition was fierce, and people were generally not generous. They had their own struggles, their own families to feed. You might stand for hours and collect almost nothing, maybe a few crusts of bread from someone's leftover meal. It was degrading work, but sometimes necessary. Theft was tempting. You were poor, desperate, surrounded by people who had more. The opportunity was there, and medieval punishments for theft were severe enough that maybe, in your mind, the risk balanced out. Some minstrels did steal. Usually food, sometimes money if the opportunity presented itself, small thefts that might go unnoticed. But getting caught meant disaster. Thieves could be hanged, or have their hands cut off, or be branded on the face. The punishment was always disproportionate to the crime. Most minstrels avoided theft, not from moral superiority, from pragmatic fear. The risk was too great. Better to starve slowly than die quickly on a gallows. Debt was another trap. You might borrow money when desperate, promise to pay it back after your next good performance, but good performances were unpredictable. Medieval debt could follow you. Creditors had legal recourse. They could have you arrested, imprisoned until you paid. And you couldn't earn money while imprisoned. The debt would only grow. Some minstrels spent years trapped in cycles of debt, borrowing to survive, working to pay back loans, never getting ahead, just barely staying alive. Others fled their debts, moved to new regions where creditors couldn't find them. This worked sometimes, but it meant abandoning any reputation you'd built, starting over as an unknown in unfamiliar territory. The lack of financial security affected everything. You couldn't plan for the future, couldn't save for emergencies, couldn't invest in better equipment or training. You lived day to day, performance to performance, never knowing if tomorrow would bring feast or famine. This uncertainty was psychologically exhausting. Let's discuss the legal status of minstrels. Because you existed in a strange legal grey zone. In most of medieval Europe, everyone was supposed to have a lord, someone you owed allegiance to, someone responsible for you. This was how feudal society worked. But minstrels were itinerant. You didn't stay in one place, you didn't have a permanent lord. This made you legally suspect. Authorities didn't know what to do with you. Some regions classified minstrels as vagrants, people without fixed homes or employment. Vagrancy laws allowed authorities to arrest you simply for existing, for not having visible means of support. You could be whipped for vagrancy, driven out of town, locked in stocks for public humiliation, all without having committed any actual crime beyond being poor and mobile. Other regions had more specific laws about entertainers. You might need a license to perform, had to register with local authorities, pay fees for permission to work. These fees were often more than you could afford, which meant you performed illegally, which meant you could be arrested and fined, which made you even poorer. The cycle was vicious. Some lords would issue letters of protection to minstrels they favoured. These documents stated that you were under the lord's protection, that harming you would offend him. These letters were valuable. They offered some legal protection, made authorities think twice before arresting you. But they were also rare. Most minstrels never received one. And even with a letter of protection, you were still vulnerable. The letter only had power in the issuing lord's territory. Beyond that, it meant nothing. You were on your own again. Marriage laws created additional problems for minstrels. Getting married required permission from a lord in many places, or payment to the church. Minstrels often had neither the connections nor the money for official marriages. So many minstrel couples lived together without formal marriage. This was considered sinful. It made any children they had illegitimate, denied those children certain legal rights. But what choice did they have? They couldn't afford the fees, couldn't get permission, so they just lived together and accepted the social stigma. Inheritance laws also discriminated against minstrels. Not that most had anything to inherit, but if by chance you did accumulate some property, passing it to your children was complicated. As a person of low social status, your property rights were limited. Lords could claim things you owned, creditors could seize assets. Your children might end up with nothing even if you'd tried to save for them. This discouraged long-term planning. Why save money that might be taken? Why accumulate property you couldn't pass on? Better to spend what you had while you had it. The legal system offered you almost no protections. If someone assaulted you, getting justice was nearly impossible. Courts didn't take your complaints seriously. You were expected to simply accept mistreatment. If you assaulted someone else, however, the law came down hard. Punishments were swift and severe. The system was designed to keep you in your place, to remind you that you had no real rights. Some minstrels tried to improve their legal status by joining religious confraternities. These were lay religious organizations that offered members certain protections and benefits. But confraternities usually had membership requirements, fees to pay, standards of behavior to maintain. Many minstrels couldn't meet these requirements, or were rejected for their profession. The few who did join found some benefit. A confraternity might help if you fell ill, might ensure you got a Christian burial, might advocate for you with authorities. But even this help was limited. You were still a minstrel, still at the bottom of society. The confraternity could only do so much. Let's talk about literacy, because most minstrels couldn't read or write. Literacy was rare in medieval Europe. Even among nobles, many couldn't read, but the literate ones had power. They could keep records, write contracts, correspond with distant allies. Minstrels rarely had access to education. You learned your trade through oral tradition, memorization, imitation, not through books or written instruction. This illiteracy had practical consequences. You couldn't read contracts even if someone offered you one, couldn't verify what authorities claimed laws said, couldn't leave written records of your experiences. Everything about minstrel life was oral and ephemeral. Songs passed from performer to performer, stories told and retold, nothing written down, nothing permanent. This meant that when minstrels died, their knowledge often died with them. Unique songs, special techniques, personal histories, all lost. The few literate minstrels had advantages. They could write down songs, create songbooks to reference, correspond with patrons, keep accounts of earnings and expenses. Some became scribes on the side, offering to write letters for illiterate people. This provided extra income, made them more valuable to potential patrons. But literacy also made you threatening to some. A literate minstrel could write seditious material, could forge documents, could spread information more effectively than an illiterate one. Authorities sometimes viewed literate minstrels with extra suspicion. You had more tools for causing trouble, more ability to organize or resist. This made you more dangerous. Most minstrels never learned to read. They didn't have time, didn't have teachers, didn't have money for lessons. They remained trapped in illiteracy their entire lives. This affected how you learned new material. You couldn't read sheet music, couldn't study written lyrics. Everything had to be heard and memorized. This limited what you could learn and how quickly. Let's consider how you learned new songs and stories. It was all about listening, watching, and remembering. When you met other minstrels, you listened carefully to their performances. If they sang something new or played a tune you didn't know, you'd focus intensely. You'd try to catch every word, every melody. Afterward, you might ask about the song. If the other minstrel was friendly, they'd teach you a verse or a line. Often, though, you had to memorize it in real time just by listening. No second chances. You practiced quietly as you walked, reciting lyrics, humming melodies, working out instrumental parts on your own. You didn't write anything down, it all lived in your head. Mistakes happened. You'd forget a line, mix up stories, change words unintentionally. Over time, songs evolved, a verse added here, a detail lost there. Oral tradition is always changing, never static. This process meant songs and stories became regional. The same ballad might sound very different in two neighboring towns. Each minstrel shaped it with their unique style and memory. Sometimes you'd meet a renowned performer who possessed rare material. Older minstrels especially carried songs nobody else knew. Learning from them was valuable, but they didn't always share freely. Their songs were their livelihood. Minstrel gatherings at fairs, festivals, or market days became hubs for exchanging material. Performers would play for each other before playing for the public. You learned not just the words, but also the performance techniques that made a song memorable. You also picked up techniques by watching other entertainers, jugglers, storytellers, acrobats. You'd see a trick, try to replicate it later. Sometimes you succeeded. Sometimes you created something new by accident. If you were lucky, you traveled with a partner who had different skills. Maybe they knew circus tricks or had a special talent for mimicry. You learned from them, incorporated bits of their act into yours. The creativity required was immense. You couldn't rely on repetition alone. Every new audience wanted something fresh, so you adapted constantly. Let's talk about languages. Medieval Europe was a crossroads of dialects and tongues. Latin for the church, local dialects, regional languages like French, English, German, Occitan. You picked up fragments of many languages, just enough to perform for different audiences, to communicate with guards, patrons, fellow minstrels. You learned how to greet people, how to make simple jokes, how to sing a refrain in a way everyone understood. Language barriers made performing risky. An innocent word in one region could mean something offensive in another. Miscommunication could lead to trouble with patrons or authorities. You learned through trial and error. If a joke landed poorly, you dropped it. If a song didn't make sense to a local crowd, you adapted the words as best you could. Flexibility was essential. Sometimes you'd have to perform for audiences who spoke a language you didn't know at all. In those cases, you'd rely on music and gestures, universal forms of communication. A well-played tune could charm almost anyone. Minstrels weren't only singers and storytellers, they were wanderers who collected cultural fragments everywhere they went. You acted as bridges between distant places, carrying news, jokes, songs, and stories from one region to another. Let's consider your daily routine. It wasn't glamorous. Most mornings started early. You woke wherever you could find shelter, a barn, a market stall beneath a tree. You packed your possessions quickly, careful not to leave anything behind. You might visit a local marketplace hoping to scrounge up food or find work. Sometimes you performed a quick piece for merchants setting up their stalls, a song for a crust of bread, a trick for a mug of ale. If there was a festival or market day, you'd spend hours preparing, checking your instrument, rehearsing fragments of songs, warming up your voice. Nervous, always, because every audience was different. Every town had its own mood, its own expectations. Performances could happen at any time. Midday in a bustling square, evening in a noisy tavern, night in a dim-lit manor hall. You adapted your act to fit the mood and setting. After performing, if you were paid, you tracked your money carefully. If not, you moved on quickly, searching for the next opportunity. You walked for miles each day. Travel was relentless. No matter the weather, you kept moving. Staying in one place meant fewer audiences and less security. Movement was your only constant. Sometimes you'd perform for hours, then spend the night with little rest. Being a minstrel meant living in a state of exhaustion. You learned how to nap anywhere, how to stay alert while hungry and tired. You avoided trouble where you could. Dangerous roads, hostile towns, aggressive guards. Still, trouble often found you. You crossed paths with bandits, wild animals, and unpredictable nobles. You learned to handle adversity. Perform with a bruised hand. Sing with a hoarse throat. Smile when your stomach hurt from hunger. Day after day you survived through resilience. The road demanded it, the audiences expected it, your body had no choice. Now let's talk about superstition and magic. Medieval Europe was steeped in folklore and belief in the supernatural. Many minstrels played into these beliefs. You performed tricks that appeared magical, simple sleight of hand, illusions with props, clever storytelling that made the impossible seem real. Some minstrels capitalized on local legends. They'd learn the folklore of a region and incorporate it into their performances. Songs about ghostly nights, haunted forests, miraculous relics. Audiences loved this material. Supernatural stories spread quickly, feeding people's curiosity and fears. Some minstrels gained reputations as magic men or wise women, even if they had no real magical power. Sometimes superstition worked against you. If a performance went badly, townsfolk might blame you for bringing bad luck. You could be accused of witchcraft or casting curses. The punishment for suspected witchcraft was severe. In some places you could be arrested, tortured, even executed for being associated with the supernatural. So you learned to be discreet. Performed just enough magic to impress, but not enough to arouse suspicion. You also created your own rituals for luck. Maybe you wore a special charm, recited a prayer before each performance, followed certain routines to keep misfortune away. The blend of art, folklore, and survival made minstrel life endlessly complex. You navigated communities' beliefs, soothed their fears, and played to their hopes every single day. Now let's focus on minstrels as chroniclers. How you shaped history, even if society overlooked your contribution. Minstrels weren't just entertainers, you were the keepers of oral history. You spread news, maintained memory, and ensured that deeds both great and small were remembered. Without you, much of what ordinary people experienced would have vanished into silence. When major events broke, wars, famines, sudden deaths of nobles, or strange omens, you composed ballads to narrate them. Sometimes you recited news verbatim, other times you shaped it to make a better story. You chose which details deserved attention, which would entertain, which might get you in trouble. This work made you both popular and dangerous. Lords understood the power of song. A ballad about a noble's victory could spread their fame far and wide. A humiliating tale or rumor could damage their reputation, even in distant lands. Sometimes patrons paid you extra to sing their praises. They wanted their deeds immortalized. Successes and family histories set to music so they'd live beyond the moment. But you also learned caution. Singing political songs could be risky depending on the audience's loyalties. As discussed, one wrong word could mean violence or banishment, so you learned to adapt lyrics, to judge which details to leave out, and when to invent a new version of the truth. Minstrels could help shape political alliances too. Weddings, peace treaties, and new rulers were marked with special performances. You'd create songs that honored all parties involved, promoting unity. Your work became part of diplomacy. Let's talk about the stories you shared outside noble circles. For common people, minstrels were their connection to the wider world. Most peasants never left their villages. News arrived through people like you. You'd perform for local audiences in market squares or taverns. Sing about a distant battle, a coronation, a famine in another region. People listened attentively, eager for information otherwise out of reach. Folk stories grew this way. Local legends fused with national events. You'd add familiar details, a village name, a river, a local hero to make the tale relevant. These performances became communal memory, blending real news with fantasy. Sometimes you acted as messengers, passing on urgent information, a warning about bandit activity, news about new taxes, edicts from distant kings. Singing was more memorable than speaking, so songs carried the news further and deeper. Your accuracy mattered, but only to a point. Entertainment took precedence. The facts often bent to fit the needs of the story or to suit the emotions of your audience. Truth was negotiable in pursuit of a good tale. You learned to improvise. If you heard a rumor about a noble, you'd test it in song. See how it was received, modify as needed. Songs became living documents, constantly updated as new events unfolded. Successful minstrels understood that storytelling was a powerful tool. You shaped the emotions of your listeners, helping them feel pride in their struggles, anger at injustice, hope for the future. Songs gave voice to people who otherwise had none. Now let's talk about the influence you sometimes wielded, however fleeting. Minstrels occasionally swayed opinions. A skillful performer could inspire crowds, encourage rebellion, cement loyalty, or assuage fears. Your words set to music carried more emotional weight than a simple edict or sermon. People repeated your verses, spread your tales, built community through shared song. This meant those in power paid attention to you, even if they didn't respect you. Lords and officials sometimes sent spies to listen to your performances, checking for dangerous sentiments or seditious ideas. If your songs were too critical or popular, you might be pressured to change them, or worse. At the same time, your performances could help resolve conflicts. Singing about peacemaking, heroic deeds, or hopeful futures fostered goodwill. You became a tool of reconciliation in small ways. Despite your low status, you were woven into the fabric of medieval life as a commentator, entertainer, and sometimes unofficial advisor. People looked to you for guidance, news, and the comfort of tradition. Now consider your own relationship with the truth. Minstrels knew that stories and history weren't static. You changed details freely. If a version of a song wasn't working, you'd create a new one. Your goal was never strict accuracy, but emotional resonance. Over time, the lines between fact and fiction blurred entirely. Did a knight slay a dragon, or did he simply win a tough battle against bandits? Was a maiden rescued by a prince, or did she escape on her own? The songs didn't care. They were meant to lift spirits and inspire, not document reality. You rarely expected your stories to last forever. You performed for the moment, shaped by the needs and curiosities of whoever was listening. If a tale survived, it was because people found meaning in it and retold it themselves. The weight of history rested lightly on your shoulders. You brought joy and comfort, warning and wisdom, fear and hope, all woven into the music and words you carried from place to place. This was your real legacy. Not coins, not fame or status, but the network of stories and songs that endured long after you moved on. You were the voice of an era that otherwise might never have spoken. Let's explore the emotional toll of life on the road. Loneliness haunted many minstrels. You were always traveling, always a stranger. Friendship was rare and fleeting. Even in a group, you were alone in your struggle, sharing hardship but never fully at ease. Villagers sometimes feared you, nobles rarely trusted you, the church condemned you. This constant sense of being unwanted weighed heavily. You learned to keep your guard up, trust cautiously, rely mostly on yourself. Homesickness was common. If you ever had a real home, memories of it became bittersweet. Songs about places and families lost were a staple of the minstrel's repertoire. Audiences understood that longing all too well. Relationships were hard to maintain. You'd meet people, form bonds, and then leave again. Detachment became a survival skill. You learned not to get too close, not to promise too much, not to hope. Yet humans need connection. So every smile from a tavern keeper, every coin from a kindly farmer, every word of thanks from a child meant everything. They were bright spots in a sea of uncertainty. There were times you felt pure joy, a generous audience, a night of laughter, a festival where your music was celebrated. These moments reminded you why you kept going. Creativity gave solace. Composing new songs, perfecting tricks, inventing stories let you express your feelings. Artistic work became a form of emotional survival, a way to process hardship, celebrate beauty, and perhaps inspire yourself and others. But despair was never far away. Hunger grinds the spirit. The threat of violence, illness, and old age always loomed. You sang about hope because you needed it just as much as your listeners. Minstrels often lived in the present. Looking ahead was painful. Looking back brought regret. You focused on the next meal, the next song, the next performance. Still, some managed to find meaning in their journey. You saw landscapes few others glimpsed, learned stories from every corner, met people from every walk of life. You became the living memory of forgotten places and moments. Animals sometimes provided companionship. A loyal dog, a clever crow. Their presence soothed your loneliness, and often they protected you from danger. You learned to value these bonds. Your relationship with your instrument was unique. It was your voice, your lifeline, your only constant companion. Without it, you were just another nameless wanderer. For some minstrels, faith became important. Not always organized religion, but personal rituals and small acts of devotion. Lighting a candle, saying a prayer, singing a hymn brought comfort during dark times. You witnessed joy and tragedy across medieval Europe. In village squares, churches, castles, and on silent, moonlit roads, you brought music, and sometimes a little peace, wherever you went. Let's consider how audiences viewed you. Children saw you as magical, a storyteller who could turn a cold night into an adventure. Some adults viewed you with cynicism, others with curiosity, a few with admiration. Sometimes villagers would invite you to their homes, share meals, and listen to your tales. These rare moments of belonging were cherished, even if brief. Audiences could be cruel. Some mocked your poverty, questioned your morals, gloated over your misfortune. You learned to perform through insults and laughter alike. Praise was intoxicating. When a crowd cheered, when coins filled your cap, when someone called you master, you felt valued, powerful, alive. These moments fueled you through the darkness. But rejection stung. An empty square, a hostile lord, a night with no food broke your spirit. Yet even then you played and sang, hoping for a brighter morning. Minstrels often sang about weather, travel, sorrow, hope, and faith. Universal themes that connected everyone, regardless of class or circumstance. Your work reminded people that hardship was shared, that joy could be found even in difficulty. The audience's expectations shaped your art. You gave them what they needed: escape, entertainment, wisdom, sometimes simple company. In this way, you were more than a performer. You were a healer of hearts, a keeper of memories, a guide through the uncertain nights of a perilous age. Now let's examine how minstrels helped to bridge cultural divides in medieval Europe. Traveling constantly, you encountered a variety of customs, languages, and beliefs. Each town had its own traditions, regional festivals, local saints, unique foods, and music. You learned from each place you visited, adapting your act accordingly. Minstrels were some of the only people who moved freely between villages, towns, and even kingdoms. You exposed isolated communities to new ideas, melodies, and stories from faraway lands. Sometimes you introduced foreign instruments or a song from another region, sparking curiosity and imitation. The cross-pollination of culture happened in small, nightly doses, no grand fanfare, just a different sound or tale woven into your repertoire. In cosmopolitan areas, you blended influences from many cultures. Fairs and markets especially brought performers together from distant territories. You picked up fragments of other traditions, learned new tricks, and combined them into your acts. This made you a carrier of innovation. Songs that started as simple tunes from one valley might spread across continents, evolving as each minstrel added their artistry. Beyond entertainment, your storytelling had real effects. Tales from far away could inspire local solutions to problems. Stories about distant lands fueled dreams and ambitions. Sometimes, ballads about heroic deeds or clever peasants fostered local pride, giving hope in hard circumstances. You also became a rare bridge between social classes. Nobles liked refinement and allegory. Commoners preferred humor and realism. You had to please both, switching skillfully between styles. For nobles, you sang about courtly love, chivalry, and high ideals. For villagers, tales were earthy, practical, full of wit and resilience. Through storytelling, you showed everyone that laughter and sorrow belonged to all people. Your interactions with the church and religious traditions added another layer. Performing hymns, miracle tales, and biblical stories, you often made sacred ideas accessible to illiterate listeners. In marketplaces or churches, song and story became teaching tools, sometimes better remembered than sermons. Occasionally, you performed for outsiders, travelers, traders, strangers from far-off lands. These encounters could bring surprising opportunities, a rare coin, a tale heard nowhere else, but also new dangers. distrust, misunderstanding, accusations. You acted as informal diplomats, introducing communities to each other's histories and hopes. Sometimes your songs welcomed strangers and fostered peace when tensions ran high. The clothes you wore, the props you used, the words you spoke, they changed from place to place, subtly shaped by what you observed and learned. Adaptability was your superpower. Let's talk about artistic legacy. Some songs and stories survived for generations, passed down by apprentice minstrels or picked up by local musicians and scribes. Over time, scattered fragments became folk traditions, shared heritage, even if the original names and stories faded away. Yet most minstrel art simply vanished. Ephemeral performances left no trace, except in the memories of those present. What endured was the sense of wonder you gave, the new vision offered, the laughter or tears inspired. You were an agent of change, quiet, invisible change. By connecting distant dots, you reminded villagers, nobles, and outsiders that they belonged to a wider world, full of possibility and surprise. And, for a few hours each night, you made that world real for everyone listening. Let's reflect on the lasting impact of the medieval minstrel's life, and why, for most people today, even a single day in their shoes would be almost unimaginable. The courage required was immense. You lived with uncertainty and danger, constantly moving, endlessly adapting. Each morning was a new test of your resilience, your artistry, your resourcefulness. The hardship wasn't just physical, but emotional and psychological. You faced hunger, contempt, loneliness, and threats with every step. Yet through music and story, you transformed that pain into communal experience, shaping the lives of countless listeners across the centuries. You survived by wit and skill, reading the room, negotiating with strangers, navigating the risks of politics, superstition, and social hierarchy. Every performance was also a gamble. You never knew when a single song could earn you bread or cost you everything. And despite it all, you offered joy and respite wherever you traveled. For a few precious moments, you could turn a cold hall or crowded tavern into a place of wonder, laughter, beauty, and hope. You connected people, preserved memories, and spread news in a world starved for connection. What legacy did minstrels leave behind? Not palaces or monuments. Most were buried in anonymity, their stories fading into the mists of forgotten roads. But the echo of their work remains. In the ballads still sung, the folk tales repeated, the musical traditions carried on by generations. Try to imagine yourself in their position even for one night. The hunger gnawing at your belly, the uncertainty about shelter or safety, the relief in a friendly face, the magic and terror of standing alone before an unpredictable crowd, the comfort of music as your only truly reliable companion. It's easy to romanticize the minstrel's journey. Films, novels, and fairy tales paint pictures of adventure and artistry. But the reality was hard, often brutal, filled with challenges few today could endure. Yet their world still calls to us. The songs of risk, resilience, and hope remain reminders of the power of art to heal, or at least to help us survive. Hey guys, tonight we've taken a long journey, farther and much rougher than stories and songs alone can show. If this glimpse into a minstrel's true life made you see music and history differently, like this video. Let us know in the comments how far you think you'd get as a medieval wanderer and what song you'd sing to make it through your darkest times. Wherever you're listening from tonight, remember, behind every easy tune or simple story, there's a world of struggle, courage, and dreams. May it help you rest a little more deeply and appreciate the songs that reach you in the quiet hours. Thank you for joining me. Sleep well.